Nothing wrong with that. Of course, if it's egoism, me first and me only, yeah, that might be a real problem. Then why don't you go down there and live by your own self? As long as you want to be by yourself, I don't need to have you as a burden on me. But together, community, teleology, deontology, working it out. Nothing's perfect. All these principles have upsides and they all have downsides. The greatest happiness has an upside and a downside. Moral virtue has an upside and a downside. Moral duty has an upside and a downside. Ethical egoism has an upside. They all have upsides and downsides. So we incorporate all of them together according to these two principles. Which works best? We're kind of stuck with right and wrong, but it's really which works best. How do you get this to do this? How do you get individuals to live in community? How do we form a social contract? At the end of the semester, we'll talk about a gentleman named John Rawls that tries to work this out for us in a very interesting way. How do we work it out so that everyone feels included, and yet some people will be here and some people will be here? Some people will get more benefit and some people will get more burden. So my special needs boy, I have a special needs boy named Joe. He's got Asperger's syndrome, high-end autism, photographic mind. Been working for Walmart for 18, 19 years now. He comes down here every spring. We go to the Tigers games. Well, they're not always on because sometimes they're someplace else. So we went to SeaWorld. It's really interesting in SeaWorld. We get to SeaWorld and we're there to see the orca whales, you know, and there's about, I don't know, maybe it sees 2,000, 3,000 people. And they get ready to start and they say, before we start, would everyone stand up? Sing national anthem. So we all stand up. And then, I'd never heard this before, it says, will current and former military please remain standing? And almost everybody sat down. I looked at a guy over here and I knew he was a Nam vet, older guy, maybe he was Korea, maybe he was, and I thought, who is watching the fort? Then I went up to northern Michigan, this town called Traverse City, about 125,000, biggest town up in northern Michigan. Went to a ball game, AA, called the Beach Bums. They were bums. 7th inning stretch. And they're in the big jumbotron. They have a picture of a young 18-year-old boy who just died over in Afghanistan from that city. Sang the national anthem. Said, now before you sit down, will all current and former military remain standing? There was one guy in front of me. He was a Nam-era veteran. And then I thought, who is watching the fort? So I call him Colonel Jack over here. He teaches drafting. I ran into Colonel Jack. I said, Colonel Jack, and I told him what happened. I said, who's watching the fort? He said, 1.25% of Americans are watching the fort, so the rest of us can enjoy the freedoms that we have fought and died for. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the freedom and not being in the military. It's a privilege to serve. But we don't require it of everybody. Why should we? And there are times we require you to serve. It's called war. I was part of the second draft lottery, got drafted out of grad school. It happened. That's life. I got run over by a van. I have fallen off a 2-story building. I've had a 2,000-pound wall get blown over and drive my head into a plywood subfloor. 70 miles an hour on a motorcycle and blew out the rear end. Blood poisoning at 16. Tried to commit suicide at 16. Life is not always user-friendly. We have choices to make every day, and oftentimes the choices are they're rote. They just happen because we do it all the time. Get up, we eat, we get dressed, we go out, we do what we want. There's nothing wrong with that. And then suddenly moral questions arise. Moral responsibilities present themselves, and we have to make a decision. That's why you're here. To learn how to acclimate yourself. Because some of you have chosen to be active. And sooner or later, all of us have to get active. Am I being too provocative? Oh, okay, cool. It'll be a little easier next week. I'll provoke you some other way. And forgive me, sometimes I want to cry and I have to stop for a minute, so I do that. It gets a little intense up in here too. Any questions for me? Okay, now be mindful of what you learned on Monday. Oh, let me do this real quickly for you. You do have a video that I posted that I'm not going to play. It's like 2.5 minutes. This gentleman right here gives a great overview of everything that I've talked about, but it's just an overview. He's not going to go into detail. Teleology, deontology, ethical egoism, ethical psychologicalism. Make sure you have that all done before you take your test next week. I'll remind you of it. Hopefully everybody gets an A on your first quiz and they're all happy. Don't forget you have an essay to do. You can turn it in early. I don't want to rush you. But if you want to, you can turn it in early. I would start watching the videos if you haven't made up your mind, just so that you have an idea about which one. 32 points, your easiest points in this course. Otherwise, if you came in late, let me know you're here. Red light, green light. When you go home, please be careful.